Hi, I'm John Cuddeback.
And I'm Sophia Cuddeback.
If you're wondering whether you can really be friends with your spouse
And raise children into responsible adults with whom you have a relationship.
and do what it takes to make a homestead, reconnecting with your body and the land wherever you live,
If you just want to think more about how to make a truly happy home in our trying times,
then the Intentional Household, a LifeCraft podcast, is for you. Join us. It is a great honor to have with me today Father Gregory Pine, OP, Order of Preachers, Dominican priest. Father Gregory, many, many welcomes to you.
Hey, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Today's topic is something I'm very excited about. I like to talk about a lot of different things, but this one's pretty close to home, no pun intended, how dad can be the spiritual head in the home. And Father, I just want you to know that I wouldn't have ventured into these deep waters if I didn't have someone with me that I trusted to keep me from just going overboard and drowning and saying something absurd. So I'm really glad to have the Thomistic wisdom here with us. And before you say anything, I know because you didn't like the way I put that, I'm going to just tell people, though they already know who you are, that Father is an instructor of dogmatic and moral theology at the Dominican House of Studies, an assistant director of the Thomistic Institute. He holds a direct doctorate from the University of Fribourg in Switzerland. Now, it's particularly as assistant director of the Thomistic Institute, the Father has had a lot of FaceTime, made a lot of wonderful videos, and I just will say has done a lot to help people see more clearly some beautiful truths. And it's particularly for that reason that I'm just very happy to have you here to talk about some things that we love to think about at LifeCraft regarding home life.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I'm pleased. I'm happy to be here.
All right. So this is where I would begin. So this notion, at the end of the day, what I want to do is get very concrete. I want to get very practical. And I want to just tell people and tell you, this is where I'd like to go. What I'd like to do is come out of this having gotten some help in thinking about my own spiritual life, then thinking about kind of my spiritual life in relationship to my wife and how kind of my spiritual life goes together in some important way with hers. And then how to think about my relationship with my children, particularly as regards being a father to them through kind of the spiritual angle, which is something that we all know is very important, but I think we don't give a whole lot of thought to. And then finally, I'm going to ask you, hey, how would you help maybe a wife and mother think about this, understanding that the husband is called to be thinking in this way? How might a wife kind of think along those lines also and kind of be together with him in that? But before we go into those kind of more specific areas, how about if I came to you, Father, and I just said this? Hey, I've heard that I should think about myself as being a kind of spiritual head in the home. Is this true? And can you give me a kind of the basics on what does that mean?
Yeah, I know you said you want to be practical. My inclinations lie more in the way of the speculative, so I'll say a bunch of impractical things by way of introduction, and then eventually we'll get down to the serious business of further speculation. So I think that so I study dogmatic and moral theology, and specifically my first love is Christology. So when it comes to headship, I think that you shouldn't make the mistake of going from kind of earthly examples and reasoning to heavenly examples. You should just start with the heavenly examples and reason your way to the earthly examples. This has been my experience specifically with understanding like instrumentality. People are like, the sacraments, wild, right? And then they're like, that must mean that Jesus' humanity is like this, right? It's like, no, go the other way. Let's talk about Jesus' humanity, and on the basis of that understanding, let's think about what the sacraments do. And I think that we can make a similar kind of argument when it comes to headship, because at least in the letters of St. Paul, the references to headship come most thick and fast with respect to Christ's headship. And so, you can come to an appreciation that headship has something to do with like a priority of a certain sort, or the governance of a certain sort, maybe an order to capture both of those, like priority and governance. And I think about it especially as like a trajectory of the life of grace. So like Christ is head, we are members, and that grace pertains to him by nature. I mean, that's a kind of stretching of a term, but nevertheless, whereas it pertains to us by gift. And so I think that like when describing the headship of our Lord Jesus Christ as, specifically thinking about the mystical body, it's like he is the only begotten Son of God, and he has wed to himself a human nature, assumed a human nature, which human nature he is filled with grace, filled to overflowing. And that grace has become ours in a certain sense, insofar as he has incorporated us into his body. And so then you think about marriage, you think about it as a one flesh union. And then you think about the way in which the creation of man and woman is described in Genesis 1 and 2. And so there must be something similar there with a kind of trajectory of the life of grace, which has roots in a kind of priority, a kind of governance, a kind of order, like which denotes a certain perfection, which denotes, blah, 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 thus and such. Now, does that answer all of our questions in the practical order with a kind of brilliant clarity? No, it doesn't. But I think that like before we just go straight for language of complementarity, we should at least be somewhat comfortable with language of priority, governance, order, perfection, like trajectory, these words that I've used, because I think at the very least they help us to understand what's at stake. And
Wow.
I think there's a real need to acknowledge some modicum of difference, in men and women on the basis of the biology, on the basis of their physical kind of constitution, which then ramifies or resonates in their emotional, psychological, and spiritual life. And that those differences in the spiritual life, they have real implications for how one lives in the context of a marriage. So I think I'd start there.
Wow. Well, that was a pretty intense start right there.
I only do intense.
Well, good. Well, then let's do it then. So well then I'm pretty keyed up and keyed in. So I'm going to let you keep going. But I think I just heard you say complementarity is super important.
Yeah.
But we do have to be, if we're really going to understand, especially kind of marriage from a Christian perspective, we have to be, you said, comfortable with some language of a kind of order, of a kind of priority. And this is where, by a loving divine providence, a husband and a father is going to have, you're saying that particularly as regards that husband's position. And I know I think you're going to tell us this is a way of serving. But of course, I mean, right off the bat, I think, some people are going to be kind of scared. You know that. We all know that. And so that makes it be all the more intense. So, with that in mind, I'm gonna keep listening.
Well, I think that our reasons for fear are not insignificant, not trifling. So here we are after a few waves of feminism in the wake of the sexual revolution, and that's part of the ambient culture. And so we can't just kind of go in for an unsubtle or unnuanced recovery of the past just by kind of allergy to the present, a kind of preferential option for the ancient on account of the fact that we wish that the last 60 years didn't happen. It's like, here we are. We were born for this time, so we need to live in this time, which means we need to account for the problematic nature of this time. And I think that there's just a real kind of urgency to this problem and whatever solution we render on account of the fact that it really does feature in our salvation and the ordinary kind of means of salvation for the Christian faithful. Because in Genesis 3, we hear that this idea of a kind of domination of man over woman is part of the fall, right? So there's a kind of natural authority to the man, which I think, again, we start in the physical order, and then we think about how that ramifies through emotional, psychological, and spiritual. And I mean, just like men are bigger. I'm just kind of starting with things like that, statistically speaking. It's like, what does that signify? All right. Is he just a lunk who drags his knuckles through life and then beats up anything which threatens his bride? I think it's more than that. But there is this real perversion that enters into the relationship on account of original sin, whereby a kind of custody or stewardship becomes in turn a kind of potential domination and abuse. So I think that we're working with our own kind of ambient cultural setting. We're also dealing with the effects of sin and vice in our life. And I think that causes a quite natural aversion on the part of many to an unsubtle or unnuanced recovery of a theory of yesteryear.
Yes.
So I think that if we're going to recover things, they need to be recovered well and with a due sensitivity to all persons involved. who probably have very legitimate fears as to potential violence and abuse.
Okay. I very much like that approach. That it just makes me want to ask you then kind of all the more, keep pushing. All right. So what does this look like under grace? What's going to look like? And again, I'm not going to drag you into a deep speculative, full consideration here, because we do want to turn to the practical. But just start to tell me a little bit more. Here I am, husband, dad, wanting to think about, kind of what I'm called to by grace here, by God's plan, in relationship, first of all, with my wife, and then that goes over into my relationship with my children. Tell me a little bit more about what headship means and is going to look like.
Sure. So in my estimation, I think it has to do with the way in which, in the Christian dispensation, the man images Christ and the woman images the church. Okay? So we get indications of this, like in St. John Paul II and those who have made his teaching more widely available in the last 25 years, certainly. But I just want to say, I think the man is called to image, and we're thinking here of sacraments, so not just like a kind of, I propose this to you for your prayerful consideration, but strong image, so sacramental signification. The man is meant to image Christ's love of the church, which is a sacrificial love. So I think that the man is the first sacrificer in the family. And I think he lays his life on the line, which isn't just a metaphorical laying of one's life on the line. I mean, it's not literalistic, but it's a kind of literal laying of one's life on the line. So I think a man is called to expend himself in very real ways for his family. And I think that lays a particular claim to him, body and soul, which is distinctive. So I think that if there's a threat to the integrity of the family, to the life of the family, it's the man who represents the first line of defense, right? I mean, the line of defense, as it were. And I think it's rooted in the biological, right? It's rooted in the physical. It ramifies through the emotional, the psychological, and the spiritual. But he's got a bigger body, and so he makes a bigger fence. It's just you start with simple things like that, and no doubt when people hear that, they're going to be like, "Well, this seems like a kind of crass." Women ends up sounding like a little pet of the home. It's no, we're not saying that. Yeah, we're just saying there are legitimate differences, and those differences are meant for. What does it read in Ephesians 5:21? Mutual subordination. But things can't be subordinated to each other in the same way at the same time because that's contradictory. So it seems like his subordination to her is a subordination of service, specifically a service expressed in sacrifice, which sacrifice in the simplest terms is a laying of one's life on the line. And so that means, right, in defense, that means in work, right? That means I'm just thinking here of for instance, the way in which the family life unfolds in the Old Testament. It's really the father of the house who provides wealth, right? He provides protection. He provides justice. He provides love. He provides meaning in a kind of primary, in a kind of, so go back to the words used at the beginning. We're talking about something that's primary. We're talking about something that has to do with order, with governance, something that has to do with a certain perfection, right? So does that mean that the woman is deficient in those things? I'm not saying that. I'm saying that she is different. All right. And it's a kind of distinction which merits, what's going on here? So I'm trying to gesture in the direction of what's going on here without just falling into kind of crass gender stereotypes, which actually don't recover what we want to recover from the past or actually reflect the reality at stake in adequate fashion. So I think it's in the household, you go to the dad for wealth. The woman might earn considerable amounts of money, perhaps more than the man. But I think in the ordinary course, all things being equal, you go to the father for that. So you go to the father to adjudicate disputes. You go to the father to provide a certain defense. You go to the father for a certain validation as well. And you think about this, it's borne out sociologically. If a father practices the faith in all its rigor and vigor, there's a high likelihood that his children will practice the faith in all of its rigor and vigor. That same high likelihood isn't borne out if the mother is the only one who practices the faith. And there are a billion reasons for that. Right. And we have to kind of descend into detail if we're going to be honest with the sociological findings. Sure. But there's a way in which man, big body, perhaps not inclined to certain things which might be classically defined as feminine. When he says, I'm here for the faith, that validates, right? That justifies. That gives a real credence to the things which transpire within the walls of the church. Right. So, I think that
Yeah.
These are the things that interest me.
Well, they certainly interest me too, and that went in the direction that we're definitely going to want to go here. That because that was raising up here the issue of particularly interacting and leading the children, particularly towards the faith, by his example. But let me just scroll back for just a moment, because I just think you said so much in there, Father, and would that we had time to kind of unpack it all. But the thing that I think was so beautiful. Most of us have heard it, but I just want to go back to it. I mean, Christianity adds so much here. I read Aristotle on these things a lot, and I don't want to get sidetracked into. I think Aristotle got this better than in general he's given credit for. He didn't get it just right. He certainly didn't. But fundamentally, he saw a natural difference, and he saw that difference being for the common good. And he saw that, he certainly sees authority as a way of serving the common good, but which I think leads up to nicely, but at the same time does not go to the key point of the Father being like Christ towards the church and having to have that sacrificial love. This is a whole new level. It's an astounding calling, and it's exceedingly challenging. It's gonna call upon grace in a very special way. But I just think that is a kind of beautiful saving element here. If we're ever tempted to think of, well, this is our opportunity to do what we want, or this is some type of domination in any kind of negative way, the Father in the home is like Christ. I mean, if we just kind of keep saying, I mean, that's the main jewel, isn't it? That's going to keep coming back of that, and then that's real love, that's real sacrifice, and it's going to take these concrete forms. So everything that we talk about more specifically, is that a fair statement, Father? Is going to be very much in the context of this is all part of a man's call to be like Christ in his family.
Yep, I think. My argumentational tack, I think like a lot of the things that you surface in these conversations make people uncomfortable for reasons aforementioned, especially in mixed company, because I think it's good to host these conversations in mixed company, because when it's just the bros, it's kind of like, huh, huh, huh. And when it's just the gals, I mean, I don't know what those conversations are like, but Jane Austen doesn't recount conversations between or among exclusively men because she felt she wasn't privy to them, so she couldn't recount them with accuracy. So I should probably lapse into silence along a similar line. Nevertheless, I think it's good because the proving ground for your theory is your practice, so I'm here for that. But we're doing it within the setting of a fallen world, which we're trying to, cooperate with the grace of God in reconstituting the supernatural order as it was intended. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of work in progress-y. And so some things might fail, but they might fail because we did them poorly, or they might fail because it's just not it's just not the case, or it's not the facts. Mm-hmm. But I think that we want to search for a kind of natural teleology on the basis of which the life of grace, elevates, or which the life of grace elevates, rather than just saying we've got the supernatural superstructure, which corresponds to nothing, So I think that we want to find the something. A lot of people, when they come across the something in the ancient or in the pagan tradition, they're like, yuck, because they'll come across Aristotle describing women after an outmoded biology in whatever, the physics, the ethics, the metaphysics, whatever it is, or the politics specifically. And they'll say can't use any of this. It's okay, there are certainly parts of that theory which are outmoded, objectionable, which are subject to limitations of its time and place. But then there are also other things which are necessary for understanding a natural teleology, on the basis of which the supernatural order makes eminently more sense.
Right.
And I think it's just it is often the case that the people recovering this type of teaching do it in a kind of type way, which then, ultimately, proves unhelpful or unfruitful.
Or ruins everything. I mean, it really, I mean, you go too far with this, you get it wrong. As G.K. Chesterton said, you fall off the tightrope either way, you've fallen off. And to push too hard in an inappropriate way in trying to restore something, I almost wonder whether it does more damage. So this is a very sensitive. The plan is incredibly beautiful, and it's a lifelong. As you said, it's work in progress. I mean, we're going to have to keep working on this all our life long. So if I come to you as husband and dad here, say, Father, I'm looking for some guidance, and particularly here, where I'd like to then keep directing you, and I really absolutely love what you're sharing here, is particularly in taking then a kind of spiritual responsibility. I think it's easy, and particularly if we do kind of just stay with, men kind of bigger, stronger, and you're kind of protecting, providing, we very often lose the spiritual side. right? We think of the husband as more, many traditional families, don't they kind of make this mistake of, dad's out there and, he's working hard. He's bringing home what we need. He's there to protect us. But we see mom perhaps more as the spiritual head. And of course, mom has many key spiritual gifts. That's not our focus right now. But shouldn't dad be seeing himself more as a spiritual head? How can we bring that out?
Yeah, I think so. You can consult Cassie Kanubi as to the nature of this image, which refers, to man as the head and then the woman as the heart.
This is an encyclical by Pius XII.
Right.
Thank you.
So there's this idea of I think the woman is the the center of affectivity of the family in a certain sense. Women tend to be more sensitized to their emotional and even psychological life, just kind of a greater awareness as to relationship and interaction. So the interior states of others, their own interior states. I really am indebted to St. Teresa Benedict of the Cross with respect to this. Well, she'll talk about the vocation of a woman, specifically as daughter, wife, and mother, as adducing from the interior life of another his or her vocation. Because in gaining access to that interior life, the woman has a particular kind of charism, as it were, for pulling it out. And you can see in a fallen dispensation how that kind of access to an interior life can be perverted and manifest in a kind of manipulation or control. By complementary logic, you can see how in a fallen world, man's kind of more exterior disposition vis-a-vis the other can result in a kind of negligence or a kind of insensate lack of concern for the other. So we can see how these things have both kind of redeemed and fallen expressions. So when it concerns the kind of spiritual disposition, if we talk about the woman as a center of affectivity, who is sensitive to the interior state, specifically of her children, able to adduce from them a kind of excellence which might otherwise lie dormant if unaccessed or if unaided. The man as a head, there's a kind of, a center, as it were, of, what would be by way of complementarity to affectivity? I suppose just cognition. Not in the sense of men are smart and women are dumb, often enough. Again, consulting the sociological data. If individuals were admitted to college on the basis of their intellectual aptitude, women would be admitted at a rate of twice as much as men in the current kind of setting or configuration of American life. So just heads up.
Right.
But there is a way in which, by virtue of his exteriority, a man is often characterized as gaining a kind of cold, calculated access to the facts of the matter, and on the basis of which he can see when sacrifices need be made, and he's always going to put himself forward as the first to make them. But you think about this in the setting of warfare. A general has to be, one, solicitous for the good of his soldiers, but as subordinated to the prosecution of the war and the success of the campaign. So he knows that he's going to send men to his death. So if he's overly sensitive to their interior states and potentially enslaved thereby, then he's always going to be halting the charge, as was the case with General Meade, for instance, who was subsequently replaced by General Grant, who sent more Americans to their grave than I think any other general, right? So it's just but that was the terms on which a war was won. And we can certainly differ as to the merit of that particular campaign, and people do. But I think that there's a way in which, as the one who has a kind of competence for the whole through the exercise, the graced exercise of his authority, which is authority of service, right? Whereby he lays his life on the line for care of those entrusted to him. He can, kind of survey, as it were, the pertinent considerations and then make a decision as to what's to be done. So I think of my own father. My dad said, we go to confession as a family once a month. And it's what, Dad? It's we go to confession as a family once a month. Did I stutter? I remember asking my dad at a young age, all right, Pops, here's the thing. I didn't talk to him this way. School, we get a summer break, church, you see where this is going. He's as long as you live in this house, you go to church on Sundays. If you'd like to not go to church on Sundays, you'll just have to find another house in which to live. So there's a kind of cold, detached way in which he surveyed the field of worship, and he sent his troops to their posts, and we abided by his dictate, So again, we're kind of muddling around for pertinent principles and trying to account for it in a way that doesn't, fall into crass gender stereotypes or fail to acknowledge the genuine excellence of men and women, given the fact that like what we're talking about here is a kind of statistical model. It's not going to work in every case because there are women who evince much in the way of masculine, like classically masculine excellence, and men who evince much in the way of classically feminine excellence. But again, on the basis of different biology, we're building it out: physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual. And on like a kind of argument of fittingness type model, trying to give an explanation as to why the Lord would communicate himself in these terms and give the grace of the sacrament of marriage specifically in this way.
Right. Okay. Well, then let's just again, so much there. You noted that. Okay. In unfolding this, we sometimes go to some things that can seem to be stereotypes. They're not absolutely universals. I mean, Aristotle pointed this out, just naturally speaking. Well, in general, men are more such and such, and that's not absolutely always the case. However, would it not be fair to say that even if the kind of natural differences themselves, there's variation in them, kind of regardless of how I experience myself as a man, regardless of where I feel that I fall into this, well, maybe I'm not so big, or maybe I'm not, maybe I have more of that sensitive feeling that has a little bit more is closer to the feminine. One way or the other, I know by the grace of the sacrament, true or false, that I am called to think of taking a kind of spiritual lead in the family. And so regardless of exactly how well fitted to this I experience myself or not, or well prepared for it, this is something I need to think in terms of discovering and stepping up to, praying into. Is this a fair statement?
I think so. Yeah.
Then can I then pull you then to say, help me think about that a little bit more? And I said I wanted to look a little bit at kind of how it makes a difference for how I relate to my wife, how it makes a difference for how I relate to the children, and that also just it's going to make a difference for my spiritual life itself. Hey, I am called to do this in my family. It seems to me, if nothing else, you're going to tell me that's an extra inspiration. I need to be working on my spiritual life, right? Yeah. Otherwise, I'm not going to be well positioned to do this. Yep. But can you give me any concrete thoughts on how, kind of, for any man who is married, he's calling upon the grace of the sacrament to help him in this, how is he called to take the lead in kind of spiritually? Help me think about that a little bit more.
Yeah, so I think about this as like, you start with baptism and confirmation. So you're given a character in baptism whereby to receive the other sacraments. So like a character which capacitates you for worship. And in confirmation, you get a further character which kind of activates in you a certain spiritual soldiery. That is to say, you are given not only a grace, but also a character for witness and for the confrontation, or for confrontation with obstacles to the belief and profession necessary for salvation. And I think that when you get married, that baptismal and confirmational character are, as it were, modalized. That's a silly word, but we'll just leave it at that. Modalized in service of your wife and children. So you are baptized, unto worship. You are confirmed unto witness, but it becomes specifically a worship and witness as a husband and father, specifically. So you're called to lead your family in worship and witness to your family and to the world in a way that brings your family or introduces your family into that witness specifically.
That's huge. That's huge. Can you pause right there?
Yeah.
How do I lead my family in worship? Wait, just narrow in on that for me. That's a beautiful statement. And I suppose that's more than just driving them to church. How am I leading them in worship?
So we'll talk, and especially, you encounter this in the Catholic tradition. It really gets accentuated in conversation with the Protestant tradition, and it gets enshrined in ecclesial documents in the 20th century, namely this triplex munera, that each of us, by virtue of our baptism, are priest, prophet, and king. And I think that the priestly dimension is really most prominent in the life of worship. So one offers, in this priestly dimension, spiritual sacrifice of the whole of his life. And so each character is a participation in the priesthood of Christ. So it's an introduction into, or kind of capacitation for, worship. And as a husband, you're kind of like the high priest, as it were, of your family. And so there is a way in which, each of the members of your household, that is to say your wife and your children, have this same baptismal character at work in their lives. And so they're able to offer spiritual sacrifice. But there's also a way in which you're called to mediate their spiritual sacrifices, to kind of bundle them up and present them to God on behalf of your family.
Wow.
And so you are to be the first worshiper of your house. That is to say, like, it might take various forms, but like in your family, you ought to be the one whose knees hit the ground first each day. And like in your family, you ought to be the one who proposes family prayer every day. In your family, you ought to be the one who like kind of rallies the troops in the morning, making sure that everyone's got the right shoes on, the right feet, and the right shirt tucked into the right pants with a sufficient amount of time to get to church. If you're in a place like Front Royal, you got to get there like 50 minutes early if you want a seat at St. John's.
Yes,
so it's like, it's not the type of thing where you just like kind of hop in the front seat of the car and start tapping your toes. It's because if this is all for, like if we mean what we say in terms of leadership, stewardship, sacrifice, then you need to be willing to expend the energy as a way by which to validate the things themselves and show to your wife and children that it's not a mere matter of convenience for you or of checking the boxes or fulfilling obligations, but that you are motivated not just for worship for your own sake, but worship for your family's sake, because you see it as the common good of the family.
Well, so I'm going to tell you just three things that just struck me in there among others. One of them was just that my knees should hit the ground first. There's something very powerful about that. I mean, just listening to that, I'm supposed to take the lead in worship. I should be thinking I should be out of bed. I should be out of bed first. I should be probably praying or when no one else in the family is up. At least this is it's not, maybe it always doesn't have to be that way, but I mean, this is a good image. If I'm taking the lead in worship, go and to your cell and pray. I mean, we need to have that private time with the Lord. So this is one way I'm going to lead. I'm going to be kind of doing it first. This is setting an example. Another thing that struck me, that you said that it really struck me, is how I'm the first sacrificer. Seems to me that means they need to see in me, I'm giving everything to the Lord. And kind of as a husband and father, I'm giving everything to the Lord in some sense for them. I mean, this is a huge way of leading them. In living my Christian vocation, my family should see me as having a general spirit of I'm a priest in a very real sense, giving my whole life to God. And purposely doing it right before them, kind of inviting them to join me. And the other thing that you said that really struck me is I'm lifting them up too, in some sense, taking their lives and joining it to my prayer. Particularly, it's interesting to think if there's like a baby in the home, someone who's not yet really able to pray for himself. I'm taking that child and I'm lifting it up. A young child, a sleeping child. I'm not just praying myself or for myself. I'm gathering together their life and taking the lead and bringing that to the Lord. I just find that so inspiring. That's incredibly rich. Thank you.
My joy. Yeah, I think too, like there's such a huge difference between, as a child growing up, seeing your father as kind of dragged to prayer or seeing your father as propelled to prayer. Like it's very beautiful. Like you can tell most, perhaps this is an overstatement, but it gives indication as to the type of person you're dealing with. Like when you witness them doing things that they think unobserved, which end up being, the most inspiring. Complicated sentence, Father Greg. What do I mean? It's like when you walk in on somebody and that person like covers up, whatever they're doing because it's inappropriate or because they're embarrassed, that says something. Like this is the type of person who, when observed, does things about which he or she is embarrassed. It's like, okay, sad. But if you walk in on somebody or happen upon somebody and like that person is praying, it's like, yeah, let's go. That gets me excited. So it's like,
it's true.
You happen to wake up in your household at 4:30 in the morning because you're thirsty, and you go downstairs and you see your dad sitting in an easy chair with his Bible open. It's like, I want to be like that man.
Yeah.
I want to pray like that man. I want to order my life and discipline my life like that man so that I can follow that man.
Can we pause there for 1 second and just remember that line? I just want to remember that line. Lord, help me to pray such that when my children see me, they want to pray like I do. I just think that's a really good thing for me to remember. So thank you for that image, please. Sorry for interrupting you.
No, I mean, I recently, my dad turned 70 this year, and it was like my one sister kind of organized a little series of letters that we would write to him, just like family members and friends and parishioners and things like that. And I realized in writing my letter to my father that my father is my hero. Like, when people ask you what your favorite this is or what your favorite that is, and you realize that you don't really know. It's like, what's your favorite movie? I don't really know. I mean, I have a pat answer that I can say, but I don't really know if it's the case because I don't really deal in favorites too terribly often. I just kind of show up to work each day, and that's sufficient. But like, I realized in writing the letter that my father is my hero, and it's in large part because he led my family. My mother was a great woman. Like a really great woman, and effervescent in a variety of ways, and made people like feel at home and love them with such tenderness and devotion. But I don't know that I ever really like stumbled on my mother praying, because like my mother was usually up to like 2:30 in the morning, gift wrapping random stuff to give to people at church the next morning, and then like falling asleep and yada yada, thus and such. It's like she was living her life. My father though is a man like, he wakes, I don't know what time he wakes up every morning, but he wakes up at early o'clock, and he's typically gotten like a holy hour, morning prayer, morning mass, and a rosary in before, like a lot of fathers have woken up. Wow. And it's like, it's the type of thing where he doesn't hold himself with a kind of superiority or in any way like reign over you in judgment because he's holier than that. It's like not in the least. It's a man who just is eminently cognizant of the fact that he is dependent upon God for his very life breath, and that he just kind of like lives out of that need in a spirit of simple abandon. There's no affectation. I mean, like, I don't even know that he has the language whereby to describe it. But it's just, that's who he is. That's just who he is. And I realized in reading the letter to my dad, I was like, I want to live like that. I want to be like you. You're my hero.
Right. Wow. That's what an amazing grace. And of course, in God's great providence, not everyone is going to have a father like that, but it's beautiful to hear your testimony. When by God's loving dispensation, you do have a father like that, the fruits are very powerful. Yeah. And the rest of us, hopefully listening, let's not be discouraged. Let's just, set our sights again on doing our best. I mean, I love how in the marriage vocation, there's always more reason to try to do better. There's the Christian vocation itself, there's already plenty of reason to try to be holy. But then when we have this extra reason, as it were, it's very integral, it's very part of it, it's very united, not extra in the sense of outside, but there's this further astounding reason that because these people need me to do this. And I just think that's part of my recognizing the gift and the challenge and the call of being a husband and father is how they need me to lead them spiritually. And this is what you're focusing us on. And can I do you have anything to say about my relationship with my wife? How do I think about being, because in many ways, I can say I have learned a lot spiritually from my wife. And obviously being a spiritual head in no way means that I'm teaching everything, that there's not still a complementarity, as you very much have pointed out. There's much, we're not emphasizing that here, but there's so much that a wife and mother has to offer, and I certainly need to learn from that if I'm going to be the husband and father I need to be. Right now, if we just focus in on what especially should I be offering, trying to give to her, what would you say?
So I think in the sacrament of marriage, the sacrament itself is caused by consent. So it's in your consent, your mutual consent, that the sacrament is forged and the grace, communicated. But that consent continues to resonate throughout the whole duration of your relationship, unto death of one of the spouses. And so I think that I think about this kind of by comparison to the way in which you love your children. I think that the father's love of his children is generative. I think what a father communicates to his children is, first, I love you. And that love imparts a kind of sense of security on the basis of which a child can know that he is at home, that he can explore, that he can always return. And then I trust you, which is a love that like it kind of grows the child into his maturity. It's a kind of love which imparts not only inspiration, but like impetus, as it were, for the type of healing and growth which conduces to Christian, manhood or womanhood, as it were. So I think that there's like a real sense in which a father's love of his children is generative. Whereas with, in the case of his wife, I think what he communicates to her is, "I choose you," and I choose you again and again and again, and there is nothing that will imperil that choice. In the sense that it's not a choice that could be otherwise. I mean, in a kind of basic sense, it could be otherwise. So we realize that as human beings, there's a kind of abiding possibility of defection. And so far as we're just like metaphysically weak, and we're always at risk of kind of lapsing into potency. But that like the man is meant to communicate to the woman, not because she like begs for it or needs it or expresses herself manipulatively and controllingly in desire of it, but he communicates to her at every kind of opportunity, "I choose you." And I think that like when the woman comes to a deeper appreciation of the degree or extent to which she is chosen, that affirms like her in her, status as daughter, wife, and mother. I wouldn't say that it generates her, because that would be like to kind of mix a metaphor.
Yeah.
But it like affirms her in her identity and capacitates her in a new way for her mission. Like it gives her a kind of comparable security, such that she can live her life with freedom, with a kind of reckless abandon.
Right.
Because I think that like the home, I feel this more and more. I don't know if "feel" is the right word, but I judge this to be the case more and more, that a home is to be a place in which the members of the household kind of mature beyond fear, in which they become fearless. Because they know that they have the love of the father. They know they have the love of the husband. And that they can revel in that, so it gives them a kind of, I don't know what to describe it apart from the word security.
Wow.
So, but I think in different ways.
Wow, Father. Whew, oh my, I'm catching my breath here. Truly, that is breathtaking. So let me try to say back something here. So I need to keep choosing my wife again and again. And there's so much richness to that. There's so many meanings of that. There's so many ways anyone who's married can appreciate that you have to choose again and again, and that choice is life-giving. How about if it's not generating? Generation is a way of giving life, but this is a different kind of life-giving. It's a different way of giving. We're giving life to our spouse, and I love how you said there's a kind of security. There's a free space where she can just really, really, really be herself, which beautifully it's analogous to the way, just right now, kind of sticking with women, the way that a father gives a daughter a kind of free space to grow into a young lady in insecurity. Right, obviously, mother's part of that too. But now there's this fuller, different kind of thing going on between spouses, where I'm if I do this right, if I love her, if I'm sacrificing the way I should be, I'm giving her a space to come alive, to fulfill her vocation that somehow would be very difficult for her were I not doing that same thing. I mean, we need one another, right? But I mean, it's a beautiful way of serving. It's going to bring out something that absolutely will not come out otherwise if I don't do this. And that's a little scary for me, Father. But nonetheless, I got to try.
Yeah. I think like in a fallen world, sometimes husbands, struggle in their relationship with their wives because, there's all kinds of tensions on account of the fact that there's like temperature taking and kind of wrist twisting and all manner of manipulation and control tactics deployed because there's a kind of insecurity, because there's a fear. And it's fascinating. Like it's funny, like in a lot of moral situations, when people say like either this or that, like when they pose to you the horns of a dilemma on which you are thereby I don't know what one does with horns of a dilemma, caught. I find that the solution often comes by way of transcending that dilemma and finding a higher synthesis. So it's like, for instance, you'll often hear people say like, oh, well, you kind of have to lie in certain situations. Like, for instance, when your wife asks you, like, do I look pretty in this dress? You just have to say yes. I just don't think that's true. Because I think that's to take a snapshot of a human life, which actually falsifies it on account of the fact that it presents it in the wrong light. Because I think a human life is something in time. There's a kind of developmental nature to it, and we should be healing and growing. And I think that like what your wife wants to know is that in your eyes, you're beautiful. She'd probably like to know that in the eyes of other people, she's beautiful. But at the end of the day, like she wants to know that she's chosen. She wants to know that you have chosen her. Not for something superficial, although like it's nice to know again that you're pretty. And I don't think that that's like trifling, and that women who think that they should be seen as pretty by their husbands are thereby floozies. I'm not saying that.
No.
But I think that if you find yourself in a situation where you feel caught, like you have to tell your wife something that you don't think, then I think that's like the failure is something that's developed over the course of weeks and months. And it's like, listen, I don't think that you look the best in that dress, but I think that you look good in a ton of dresses besides. And at the end of the day, like I chose you because I thought you were beautiful, and like I continue to choose you because I think that you are beautiful. And if like the past is any indication of the future, I will continue to do so. So it's like, how do you communicate that in a particular moment? I think it's hard, but I think the point is that you ought to be communicating that over the whole course of a marriage.
Sure.
Which, yeah, obviously it doesn't like get you out of a moral bind in the situation itself. I don't think that anyone should ever lie. There's a difference between certain pleasantries and certain kind of blah 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 messages. But
right. I like it, and I think this is implied in what you said, but again, just say it out loud. I mean, there is this beautiful aspect of, and even if on the physical level something were to happen, and you're not beautiful anymore, I see you. I see you as the person you are, and I choose you. And as the Randy Travis song says, and if all your hair falls out, I'll love you just the same, right? I mean, this is the deepening love, and that deepening further choice. I mean, isn't that a big part? Wow, the whole topic in itself of what exactly are we choosing when we choose you, right? We better mature in that, and God grant that the growth of our relationship be one where we're seeing more, we're loving better, and we're choosing in a richer kind of way. And this that beautiful aspect of I'm going to keep choosing. That's a way of leading. And we're almost out of time here, Father. I'm so grateful. If we could just kind of then bring it back. I had said I wanted to say something. Do you have any one word on from if a wife is thinking, how do I call my husband to lead better, to kind of to see how he should be doing this, how be a kind of spiritual head, to lead and worship in the family? What would you say?
I think sometimes, there are different tactics to adopt. Tactic is probably a kind of a crass word in this. But I think that like a man finds it very painful, very distressing to hear that he is weak, or to hear that he is wounded, or to hear that he doesn't exercise his headship, whatever his authority or his leadership in the family well. And I think he often finds it very difficult to act upon that observation or condemnation, and especially from his bride. So I think that like and I don't mean this in the sense of play mind games, but I think that you have to see in him what he does not yet see in himself and kind of affirm it into existence. So like a wife can only be a wife. She can't be both a husband and a wife. So she doesn't say like, well, he's not exercising leadership, so I have to compensate for his leadership. She has to do what Ephesians 5 says with respect to her. She has to be subordinate to him in the ways that are appropriate to her and her state, and then elicit from him some modicum of leadership. Right. And to identify it where it lies dormant, and to affirm it into existence, and to kind of coax the good out of him, which he has not yet kind of marshaled of his own stores. Now, obviously, like in real time, somebody's going to have to get the kids in the car, and somebody's going to have to say it's time to go to confession. And women are going to have to do those things in certain instances. But I don't think that you ever can wholly despair of it. And I think that you can find ways in which to ask God for the grace to see it in him, even if he doesn't see it in himself. And then, to do what lies within your power as a wife, as a mother, to bring about that transformation in a way that's not controlling or manipulative, but which is genuinely affirming and loving.
Wow. I wish we could unfold more. We can just savor for a moment, affirm into existence. I mean, in a sense, isn't that what God's love for us? I mean, he's constantly seeing what we should be, right? The father of the prodigal son kept seeing what this young man can be. Isn't that the way God is toward us? And here we have perhaps a uniquely powerful and beautiful instance of perhaps a suffering woman who continues to love. She continues to choose, and she helps her husband see something about himself that he hasn't seen, and she tries to love it into existence, and then leaves in God's hand exactly how that unfolds. But what an incredible act of faith that is, it seems to me.
Yep.
A final word for husband and dad. Just the final word of encouragement. What should we go out there and do?
Yeah, I think my last takeaway point is you are not responsible for dealing yourself a good hand. You are responsible for playing the hand that you have been dealt. So if you didn't have a good dad, the expectation is not that you would comport yourself like a father who had a good dad. The expectation is that you would do your best to heal and grow as a father, to love your wife and to love your kids. Do the best with what you have, given the constraints. So I think that sometimes we consider the battle lost on account of the fact that we don't occupy the high ground. Not the case. Decidedly not the case. God isn't so much concerned with what could have been as with what is, and he just wants to see what you'll make of your freedom. And you're genuinely free. And there are no set of obstacles or hindrances to the exercise of your freedom which are sufficiently strong as to defeat you. Because, yeah, with God, all things are possible.
And he's going to answer our prayers, isn't he?
He is.
And now we have a clearer sense of what we're praying for. Father, thank you so much for taking the time. I really, really appreciate it. And I hope we can continue this conversation in several further directions.
Party on. I look forward to it.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in this episode of The Intentional Household. If you've enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, and leave a rating or review. If you have any topic requests, please send them to lifecraftgroup@gmail.com. For our Wednesday reflections, free courses, reading groups, and live events, please visit life-craft.org.